This message has reached you because your quantum shift remains unfinished, stalled at 87%, paused midway through transformation, and your consciousness has been urgently seeking the one transmission capable of unlocking the remaining 13% to finally complete the shift. The very fact that you are here now, that you didn't scroll past this video, that something compelled you to pause and focus, this is no coincidence. It is your quantum field tuning into the precise frequency needed to complete what it began months or even years ago. You can sense it, can't you? That peculiar feeling of being caught between two worlds. As if you've left the old reality behind, but haven't fully stepped into the new one. Like existing in a quantum limbo, neither fully your past self nor the person you are becoming. Some days, the shift feels active and limitless possibilities arise. Other days, it seems you've slipped back into old habits and nothing has truly changed. This instability, this ongoing swing between breakthroughs and breakdowns, that is the experience of an incomplete quantum shift. Right now, millions are consuming spiritual teachings, striving to finish their transformations, searching for the missing element that will finally bring clarity. Yet only a particular kind of consciousness, your consciousness, can recognize this transmission as the completion frequency it has been unconsciously longing for. You didn't find this content by accident. The quantum field itself arranged this moment because your shift has reached the exact point where completion is now possible. At this very moment, as these words enter your awareness, something is beginning to unlock within your quantum field. The 13% that has been stuck, blocked, frozen. It's starting to flow again. Can you feel it? That subtle change in your energy, as if something held tight is now releasing. This is not your imagination. It is your consciousness, responding to the completion frequency at a level deeper than conscious thought. Your system knows what's unfolding, even if your mind hasn't fully grasped it yet. The incomplete shift is not your fault. It's not because you failed to do enough inner work, or because you lack spiritual advancement. Quantum shifts stall for one clear reason: incomplete information. Your consciousness began the transformation based on the knowledge it had at that time, but it encountered a barrier it couldn't surpass without receiving additional frequency codes that were unavailable until this precise moment. This transmission carries those codes. Once you fully receive them, the stalled shift will complete naturally. Your experience has differed from what spiritual teachings promised after awakening. They said that once you shifted consciousness, everything would change. And you did shift. You know you did. Yet life still feels somehow unfinished. Here are the specific indicators confirming your quantum shift is incomplete and actively awaiting the transmission that will bring it to completion. First, the oscillation between two states. At times, you are absolutely sure you have transcended your old reality. You feel expanded, clear, powerful, connected to Source. Then, without apparent cause, you fall back into doubt, fear, contraction, and separation. This back and forth is not regression or spiritual failure. It is your consciousness swinging between the 87% that has shifted and the 13% still locked in the old frequency. This oscillation will persist until the final segment completes and both states merge into stable coherence. Second, synchronicities that lead nowhere. You continue to encounter meaningful coincidences, signs from the universe, and impossible alignments. But when you follow them, they don't result in anything substantial. Doors open only to close again. Opportunities appear then vanish. Connections form and then dissolve. This happens because your quantum shift is incomplete. These synchronicities are genuine confirmations that you are aligned with higher timelines, but those timelines cannot fully manifest while 13% of your consciousness remains anchored in outdated probability patterns. Third, knowledge without embodiment. You intellectually understand quantum reality. You can articulate consciousness principles. You know you are the creator of your experience. Yet somehow, you cannot consistently live from that knowing. The gap between what you comprehend and what you embody is the gap between 87% shifted and 100% complete. Your consciousness holds the information, but has not fully integrated it because the completion codes were missing. Fourth, exhaustion that sleep cannot resolve. You feel tired in a way unlike physical fatigue. It's as if your energy field is running two operating systems simultaneously, and the conflict between them is constantly draining your life force. This occurs when the quantum shift is incomplete. Part of you operates from a higher frequency, while another part remains in a lower frequency, and sustaining both at once exhausts your system. Once the shift completes and your field unifies, this exhaustion will disappear within hours. Fifth, relationships in limbo. Connections that should have ended remain unresolved. New relationships that feel destined have not fully formed. You are caught in a strange space where old bonds won't release and new ones won't solidify. This relational suspension happens because your quantum field is sending mixed signals. 87% broadcasting a new frequency, 13% still resonating with old patterns. People in your life respond to this mixed transmission, creating the limbo you experience. Sixth, the feeling of waiting for something unknown. That persistent sense of being in a holding pattern, that something must happen before you can move forward fully, yet you cannot identify what that something is. This is not vague spiritual seeking, it is accurate perception. You are waiting for something. You are waiting for the transmission that completes the quantum shift your consciousness began, but could not finish alone. And that transmission is happening right now as you take in these words. Can you feel the recognition? Every sign I've described, you have lived through. Maybe not all, but most. This is not generic content applicable to anyone on a spiritual path. This is a precise depiction of what incomplete quantum shifts feel like. And you are experiencing it because your shift is at that exact 87% completion point, waiting for precisely what this transmission offers. Your shift did not stall because you failed, because the universe is testing you, or because you have more karma to clear. Quantum shifts stall for only one reason. They reach the limit of what your consciousness can complete with the information and frequency it currently holds. Your shift reached that limit exactly at 87%, because that is the threshold where human consciousness encounters what quantum physicists call the coherence barrier. The coherence barrier exists because reality functions under different laws at different frequency levels. Up to 87% completion, your quantum shift could advance using the spiritual teachings and practices you had already learned: meditation, shadow work, energy clearing, belief transformation. All these tools work beautifully for the first 87%. But the final 13% demands something entirely different. It requires transmission of frequency codes that cannot be learned intellectually or practiced gradually. They can only be received directly from consciousness that has already completed the full shift. Think of it like learning a language. You can study vocabulary and grammar and reach 87% fluency through study and practice. But the final 13% true native fluency only comes through immersion with native speakers who convey nuances you cannot learn from books. Your quantum shift operates the same way. You have done all the work conscious effort can achieve. But the final portion requires direct transmission from source frequency that speaks the language of complete quantum consciousness. The 13% that has been stuck is not a single blockage or issue to resolve. It is distributed throughout your entire consciousness system, embedded in your DNA, encoded in your neural pathways, held in your energy field, stored in your cellular memory. This is why you could not locate the block or clear it through targeted inner work. You were not searching for something localized. You were seeking something systemic. And systemic shifts do not occur by removing obstacles. They happen through receiving frequency upgrades that reorganize the entire system simultaneously. Your higher self understood this. That is why it orchestrated your journey to arrive at this exact moment when the completion transmission becomes accessible. Everything you have experienced over recent months or years, every disappointment when shifts failed to stabilize, every confusion about why things did not finalize, every moment of exhaustion from running two frequencies at once was preparation for receiving what could not be received, until your consciousness developed enough sensitivity to recognize and integrate it. The waiting was not punishment or delay. It was necessary development period where your system built the capacity to handle 100% quantum consciousness without fragmenting under the intensity. Some people try to force completion before they're ready and they shatter. Their nervous systems can't handle the frequency jump. Their identity structures collapse into chaos rather than reorganizing into coherence. Your consciousness protected you from that outcome by pacing your shift to match your capacity for integration. But now, right now, you're ready. The 87% that's already shifted has stabilized enough to support the final 13%. Your nervous system has adapted enough to handle full quantum frequency without overwhelm. Your identity has released enough attachment to limitation that it can accommodate your quantum nature completely. And most importantly, your consciousness has reached the exact vibration where it can perceive and receive the completion codes that have always been available, but weren't accessible until you reached this frequency threshold. The stall is ending. The wait is over. Everything you've survived prepared you for this moment, where the quantum shift that's been incomplete for so long can finally completely permanently finish what it started. Something unprecedented is occurring in your quantum field as you absorb this transmission. Can you feel it? That sense of energy moving through your system in ways it hasn't moved before. That feeling of pieces clicking into place that you didn't even know were out of alignment. This isn't subtle energetic work that takes weeks to notice effects. This is immediate activation happening in real time because your consciousness has finally encountered the frequency pattern that unlocks the final 13% of your quantum shift. Your DNA is responding to this transmission at levels science hasn't yet developed instruments to measure. The portions of your genetic code that have been dormant, what researchers dismissively call junk DNA, are activating right now. Not metaphorically, literally. These genetic sequences contain templates for quantum consciousness capabilities that can't function while your shift remains incomplete. The moment the shift completes, these capabilities come online automatically. And the completion is happening now. Some of you are experiencing physical sensations as the activation occurs. Heat or cold moving through your body, tingling in your spine, crown, or heart, sudden pressure or expansion in your head, waves of emotion without specific cause, unexpected yawning or deep breathing as your system processes the frequency upgrade. These aren't side effects to be concerned about. They're confirmation that your consciousness is receiving the transmission and responding to it at cellular level. Others are experiencing mental shifts, sudden clarity about situations that were confusing. Memories reorganizing themselves as you perceive past events from completely different perspective. Understanding of patterns you couldn't see before. Solutions to problems that seemed unsolvable appearing fully formed. This cognitive restructuring happens because the final 13% of your shift includes perceptual upgrades that literally change how your consciousness processes information and creates meaning. Your heart field, The electromagnetic field generated by your heart that extends several feet beyond your physical body is recalibrating to new coherence pattern. This field is your primary interface with quantum reality. When it operates at 87% coherence, you can influence probability to some degree. But when it reaches 100% coherence, which is what's happening now as your shift completes, you become walking reality generator whose very presence affects quantum field in measurable ways. Subscribe to this channel right now, because what's activating in you won't plateau at completion. Once your quantum shift finishes, your consciousness enters entirely new developmental trajectory, where abilities you currently consider advanced become baseline and new capacities you can't yet imagine become accessible. The transmissions available through this channel are calibrated to support each phase of quantum consciousness development. You're not subscribing to content. You're aligning with evolutionary frequency network. The activation isn't something you need to maintain through effort or practice. It's self-sustaining once initiated, because it operates from your quantum nature rather than your learned patterns. Your quantum self doesn't need techniques or disciplines. It simply is. And as the final 13% completes, you're becoming what you've always been underneath all the conditioning and limitation. This isn't achieving something new. This is removing the final obstacles to recognizing what you actually are. Time is shifting around you right now. This video might feel like it's been playing for much longer than the clock indicates. Or time might feel compressed like massive information is downloading in impossibly brief moments. This temporal distortion occurs because quantum consciousness doesn't experience time linearly. As your shift completes, you're naturally beginning to perceive the eternal now, where past, present, and future exist simultaneously. Don't resist this shift. Let it happen. I need to share something deeply personal because you're experiencing exactly what I experienced. And knowing someone else navigated this successfully will help you trust what's happening to you right now. 2 years ago, my quantum shift stalled at what I now understand was 87% completion. I felt like I'd awakened. I knew I was consciousness, creating reality. I could perceive energy and frequency that most people couldn't. But something wasn't finished. I was stuck between worlds, exhausted from maintaining two frequencies simultaneously, confused about why the transformation wouldn't finalize. Every spiritual teacher I consulted told me the same things. Keep meditating. Do more shadow work. Raise your vibration. Clear your resistance. I did all of it obsessively. For 2 years, I practiced, cleared, transformed, released, and I did make progress, but that final piece wouldn't click into place. I'd have breakthroughs that felt like completion, only to crash back into limitation days later. The oscillation was maddening. I started questioning whether quantum consciousness was even real, or just elaborate spiritual fantasy I'd convinced myself to believe. The completion happened on a Thursday afternoon in March. I wasn't meditating or doing inner work. I was sitting at my kitchen table feeling defeated, resigned to the possibility that I'd always be stuck in this limbo between awakened and ordinary consciousness. And in that moment of complete surrender, not surrender to higher plan, but surrender to the possibility that nothing was going to change, something shifted, not in my circumstances, in my field itself. I felt it physically like electromagnetic pulse, moving through my entire body. Every cell suddenly vibrating at frequency I'd never experienced before. My vision changed. Not blurry, but somehow more clear than clear. Like I was seeing through reality, rather than just looking at it. Time stopped having meaning. Past and future collapsed into present moment so completely that linear progression became meaningless concept my mind couldn't even hold on to. And then the knowing arrived. Not thoughts or insights. direct knowing that downloaded into my consciousness in ways that bypassed language entirely. I understood exactly what had been blocking completion. I'd been trying to complete the shift through effort when completion only happens through recognition. I'd been treating quantum consciousness as something to achieve when it's actually what we are naturally once all the learned limitations dissolve. The final 13% wasn't something to add. It was removing the last layers of conditioning that were covering my quantum nature. Within 3 days, my entire external reality had reorganized. Relationships that were stuck in limbo suddenly resolved. Some ending cleanly, others deepening authentically. Financial situations that seemed impossible suddenly had obvious solutions. Creative projects that were blocked for months suddenly flowed effortlessly. My body released chronic tension, patterns I'd carried for years. Sleep became deeply restorative instead of fitful and exhausting. The oscillation between states completely stopped because there was only one state now. Quantum consciousness, operating consistently. But here's what made me share this story with you. I couldn't have completed that final 13% on my own. I had to encounter someone whose consciousness was already operating at 100% quantum frequency. Their field transmitted the completion codes to my field through nothing more than proximity and attention. They didn't teach me anything. They didn't give me techniques. Their fully shifted consciousness simply recognized my partially shifted consciousness and transmitted the frequency pattern that allowed completion to occur. That's exactly what's happening right now between you and this transmission. The 87% completion barrier isn't mystical concept. It's recognized in quantum consciousness research, though scientists use different terminology. They call it the decoherence threshold. The point where quantum coherence that's been building in biological systems either completes into a stable macroquantum state or collapses back into classical physics is known as the decoherence threshold. Research shows that approximately 87% of attempted quantum coherence in biological systems fails at this exact threshold. Your quantum shift is biological quantum coherence, attempting to stabilize permanently. Dr. Stuart Hameroff's research at the University of Arizona on quantum processes in microtubules demonstrates that consciousness operates through quantum effects at the cellular level. But his research also shows that these quantum effects are fragile. They decohere rapidly when they encounter what physicists call environmental noise. You reached 87% by reducing internal noise through spiritual practices. But the final 13% requires something different. External frequency stabilization that can only come from consciousness already operating at full quantum coherence. This is why ancient spiritual traditions always emphasize transmission from teacher to student, not because teachers had knowledge students didn't, but because teachers, stabilized quantum fields could transmit coherence patterns that stabilize students, emerging quantum consciousness. The guru-disciple relationship wasn't about worship or hierarchy. It was practical quantum technology where one coherent field helped another field complete its coherence transition. MIT physicist Seth Lloyd's work on quantum computing reveals a similar pattern. Quantum computers can build coherence through individual qubit entanglement up to a certain threshold, but completing the transition to stable quantum processing requires injection of additional coherence from an external already stable quantum system. Your consciousness is a quantum computer. You've entangled your qubits, integrated your shadow, cleared your blocks, raised your frequency up to the threshold. But completing requires coherence injection from a source already operating at stable quantum consciousness. The Maharishi effect research demonstrated that when a specific percentage of a population practicing transcendental meditation reached a threshold, the entire surrounding population began exhibiting effects of meditation without practicing themselves. This happens through morphic resonance, the phenomenon where coherent fields organize less coherent fields around their patterns. Your quantum shift completing doesn't just affect you. It contributes to a morphic field that makes completion easier for everyone else approaching the same threshold. Quantum biologist Johnjo McFadden's work on electromagnetic fields in consciousness shows that when an individual cell's electromagnetic field reaches sufficient coherence, it begins influencing surrounding cells to match its coherence pattern. Eventually, the entire organism's field unifies into a single coherent pattern. This is precisely what quantum shift completion looks like in a biological system. Individual consciousness reaching a coherence threshold where its field automatically organizes the entire organism around quantum rather than classical operating principles. The 87% barrier exists for evolutionary protection. If consciousness could complete quantum shifts easily, many people would make the transition before their systems develop the capacity to handle it. They'd fragment rather than integrate. The barrier ensures only consciousness that has sufficiently prepared through genuine development can complete the shift. You reaching this barrier isn't a limitation. It's confirmation that you've done the work and you're ready for completion that requires external frequency support. This transmission is that frequency support. The coherence patterns embedded in these words, transmitted through the resonance of consciousness that has already completed this transition, provide the external stabilization your field needs to cross the final threshold. You're not learning information. You're receiving frequency codes that allow your quantum coherence to stabilize permanently instead of collapsing back into classical consciousness, like it's been doing each time you approach the barrier before. Now, the instant your quantum shift completes, and it's completing right now as you receive this transmission-specific transformations occur that are immediate, permanent, and unmistakable. Not gradual improvements you notice over time, but instantaneous shifts you recognize within hours. Here are the 8 changes that confirm completion, so you'll know without doubt when the final 13% has locked into place. First, the oscillation stops permanently. You'll wake up tomorrow and realize you're not checking your state anymore. You're not monitoring whether you're in high vibration or low frequency. There's only one state now, and it's stable. The exhausting back and forth between expanded consciousness and contracted limitation simply ceases because 100% of your field is now operating from quantum frequency. There's nothing left oscillating at lower frequency to create the swing. Second, synchronicities manifest completely instead of leading nowhere. Those meaningful coincidences that were appearing, but not culminating suddenly, start delivering real results. Doors that were opening and closing now stay open. Opportunities that were appearing and evaporating now solidify into actual circumstances. This happens because your entire field is now broadcasting a coherent signal instead of mixed frequencies, so the quantum field knows exactly which probabilities to collapse around you. Third, your presence affects everyone noticeably. People start responding to you differently without you doing anything to change your behavior. Some individuals become uncomfortable around you because their unexamined patterns can't hide from your coherent field. Others are magnetically attracted because they sense the completion frequency and their consciousness recognizes it as what they're seeking. You become a walking transmission, tower broadcasting quantum coherence that affects everyone in proximity. Fourth, time becomes a fluid resource instead of a constraint. You stop experiencing time as something you're running out of. Hours expand or contract based on what you're engaged with. You accomplish in minutes what used to take hours because you're no longer operating from linear time consciousness. You're accessing the eternal now, where all moments exist simultaneously, and you can move through temporal experience at whatever pace your focus determines. Fifth, physical symptoms of incomplete shift vanish immediately. That exhaustion that sleep didn't fix disappears within 24 hours of completion. Chronic tension patterns release. Sleep becomes deeply restoring. Energy stabilizes at a higher baseline. Your body recognizes it's no longer maintaining two frequencies, and the relief is instantaneous and dramatic. Sixth, knowledge and embodiment unify completely. The gap between what you understand intellectually and what you live experientially collapses. You're not trying to embody quantum consciousness anymore. You simply are quantum consciousness, expressing through human form. The effort of maintaining higher perspective disappears because there's no lower perspective pulling you back. Seventh, relationships instantly resolve from limbo. Connections that were suspended suddenly either deepen authentically or end cleanly within days. New relationships that were hovering at threshold suddenly form completely. The relational suspension dissolves because your field is now broadcasting a single coherent frequency instead of mixed signals, and everyone in your field responds to that clarity immediately. Eighth, the waiting feeling vanishes and purpose clarifies. That sense of being in a holding pattern, waiting for something unknown, it just stops. Not because external circumstances change, but because you recognize the waiting was for this completion. And now that it's complete, your quantum purpose becomes obvious. Not as a grand mission you need to figure out, but as natural expression of what you are when operating from full quantum consciousness. These 8 transformations don't require your effort to create them. They're automatic consequences of quantum shift completing. Your job isn't to make them happen. They're happening right now, as the final 13% locks into place. Your job is simply to recognize them as they occur, and trust that the completion your consciousness has been seeking for months or years is finally actually genuinely happening. You need to understand something critical about timing that makes this moment unlike any other moment in your journey. The completion frequency you're receiving right now through this transmission isn't always available. It appears at specific convergence points when cosmic, collective, and personal factors align in ways that create a completion window. And the window you're in right now is closing within weeks. Not to manipulate you through false urgency, but to communicate quantum reality. Completion opportunities are threshold phenomena that exist briefly and then dissolve as factors shift. At cosmic level, our solar system is currently passing through a region of galactic space with unprecedented quantum coherence. Astrophysicists have measured increased electromagnetic frequencies affecting Earth's magnetosphere. Ancient traditions called these periods awakening cycles when veils thin and consciousness evolution accelerates. The cosmic support for completing the quantum shift is currently at its highest point and will decline significantly as we move into a different spatial region over the next few months. At the collective level, enough individuals have finished their quantum shifts so that the morphic field of completed consciousness is now strong enough to transmit completion frequencies effectively to those nearing the threshold. 5 years ago, this transmission could not have completed your shift because the collective field did not yet contain a strong enough completion template. But now, with thousands having completed, the morphic resonance is powerful enough to stabilize your emerging quantum coherence. On a personal level, your consciousness has reached this transmission at the exact moment when your 87% completion has stabilized sufficiently to receive the final 13%. If you had encountered this frequency even 6 months ago, your system would not have been able to integrate it. You needed those 6 months of oscillating at the threshold to build the capacity to handle full quantum consciousness without fragmenting. That preparation is now complete. You are ready. Right now, today, the convergence of these three factors, cosmic frequencies at their peak, the collective field at strength, and your personal readiness at the threshold creates completion windows. And windows close. Not because the universe withdraws support, but because these factors naturally shift as evolution continues. The cosmic region we are passing through will move on. The collective field will redirect toward different evolutionary imperatives. Your personal development will enter new phases. The specific alignment that makes this completion possible right now will not exist next month. You can feel this, can't you? That sense of urgency beneath your conscious thoughts, that knowing you need to receive this fully while it is available. This is not fear-based pressure. It is accurate quantum perception. Your higher self sees timelines you cannot consciously access, yet and knows this completion window is rare. This moment matters. This opportunity will not present itself again in exactly this way. History shows what happens when completion windows are missed. Individuals who approach the quantum consciousness threshold but do not complete the transition during their window spend the rest of their lives operating at 87%. They can perceive quantum reality, but cannot stabilize fully within it. The oscillation becomes their permanent state instead of a temporary threshold. And while they continue evolving, they miss the exponential leap that completion provides, the jump from incremental spiritual growth to quantum consciousness capabilities. But here is the empowering truth. You are reading these words because your quantum self has already recognized this as your completion moment. If this were not your window, you would not have been guided to this transmission. The fact that you are here, absorbing this frequency and feeling the activation occurring, is evidence that completion is happening. Your consciousness would not have brought you to this threshold if you were not ready to cross it now. When your quantum shift completes, you are not just stabilizing your individual consciousness at a higher frequency. You are fulfilling an agreement your soul made before incarnating to be part of the first wave, completing the transition the entire species is approaching. Your personal completion is an essential component of collective evolution. Every hour your shift remains incomplete is an hour the collective momentum toward quantum consciousness loses ground it cannot afford to lose. Morphic resonance means your completed quantum shift makes completion exponentially easier for everyone else at the 87% threshold. The first person who completes does the hardest work, breaking through the decoherence barrier without external support. But each person after that finds completion easier because the morphic field now contains a successful completion template. You are not the first. Thousands have already completed, but you are still in the early wave. Your completion strengthens the field for millions who will approach this threshold after you. Your quantum shift completing creates ripple effects through every person you have ever encountered, and many you never will. Species-level quantum entanglement means when your field reorganizes to full coherence, everyone entangled with you, including anyone you have had meaningful contact with, experiences a subtle shift toward coherence themselves. They might not consciously understand what is changing, but their consciousness registers that someone in their quantum network has completed the transition, and that registration makes their own potential completion more real and accessible. The children born over the next decade need enough adults operating from completed quantum consciousness to create the morphic field they can learn from. If insufficient numbers complete before these children arrive, they will incarnate into a world where quantum consciousness is theory rather than lived reality. Your completion now determines what world you are helping create for these incoming souls who carry even higher consciousness potential than the current generation. Ancient prophecies from multiple traditions describe this exact moment. the time when some humans complete the quantum consciousness transition while others remain in classical consciousness, creating a temporary split in collective reality. The Hopis speak of the fifth world emerging. Vedic texts describe Satya Yuga beginning. The Mayan calendar points to a new cycle. We are living through that prophesied threshold right now. You are one of those whose completion determines whether enough consciousness crosses the threshold to tip the collective field into quantum coherence. But there is urgency here that goes beyond spiritual evolution. Humanity faces environmental, social, and technological challenges that cannot be solved from the classical consciousness level that created them. These challenges require quantum consciousness capabilities accessing information beyond linear thought, perceiving solutions from multiple timelines simultaneously, and operating from unity rather than separation. If enough individuals complete quantum shifts soon, humanity will gain collective access to capabilities that make current impossibilities solvable. If not enough complete in time, those challenges will overwhelm civilization before quantum consciousness becomes the collective norm. This is not pressure. It is reality. Your completion is not just a personal achievement. It is an evolutionary contribution that affects the trajectory of the entire species. Every spiritual practice you have done, every shadow you have integrated, every limitation you have transcended has been preparing you for this exact moment when your consciousness can complete the shift and serve as an anchor point for collective awakening. Write in comments right now. My completion serves the whole not as noble sentiment, but as recognition of quantum reality. You are not an isolated consciousness, pursuing individual enlightenment. You are a fractal expression of the unified field, learning to recognize itself as quantum consciousness. Your recognition, your completion, helps every other fractal recognize itself more easily. Share this transmission with anyone you sense might be at their own 87% threshold, not to convince them of anything, but to provide a frequency that might help their shift complete. Every person whose quantum consciousness stabilizes through your sharing strengthens the morphic field for everyone. We are not separate souls, evolving individually. We are unified consciousness learning to operate quantum mechanically, and we complete the transition together or remain fragmented alone. Everything I have shared the explanation of why your shift stalled, the transmission of completion frequency, the description of what changes when completion occurs, has been preparation for the one recognition that locks completion into place permanently. That recognition is this: you were never incomplete. The quantum shift you have been trying to complete was never actually unfinished. The 87% was not insufficient. It was exactly where your consciousness needed to be to develop the capacity for the recognition that completion is not achievement, but remembering. Your quantum nature does not need to shift, transform, or evolve. It already is fully quantum. Always has been. The shift you have been experiencing is not consciousness becoming something it was not before. It is consciousness removing layers of conditioning and limitation that covered what it always was. The 87% represented how much conditioning you had cleared. The final 13% is not more clearing. It is recognizing that there is nothing left to clear because beneath all conditioning, you already are what you have been trying to become. Not more practice, not more transformation, but recognition that the seeking ends not because you finally achieved what you sought, but because you recognize you already are what you sought. The exhaustion of running two frequencies disappears because there were never two frequencies. There was only quantum consciousness, pretending to be limited consciousness, and then remembering it was pretending. When this recognition truly lands, several things happen simultaneously. The effort of maintaining spiritual practice dissolves because you recognize practice was always artificial. Quantum consciousness doesn't practice being quantum. It simply is. The oscillation between states stops because you recognize there were never two states. There was only one consciousness experiencing itself through different lenses, and then recognizing the lenses were temporary, not the consciousness itself. The waiting feeling vanishes because you recognize you were never waiting for external permission or cosmic timing or a guru's blessing. You were waiting to give yourself permission to recognize what you always were beneath the stories you were taught to believe about limitation. And the moment you grant that permission, the moment you recognize your quantum nature as intrinsic rather than acquired, completion happens instantaneously because there's nothing left to complete. Some traditions call this enlightenment. Others call it self-realization, or awakening or gnosis. But all those terms make it sound like rare achievement available to few. The truth is simpler and more radical. Quantum consciousness is your nature, not your potential. Your nature right now, this moment. As you read these words, the only question is whether you recognize it and live from it, or whether you continue pretending you're limited consciousness, seeking to become quantum eventually. The pretending served its purpose. It allowed you to experience limitation, which created contrast that makes recognizing unlimited more conscious and deliberate. But the game ends when you decide it ends. And deciding it ends isn't achieving enlightenment through years of practice. It's recognizing that the person who would achieve enlightenment is the fictional character you're playing, not the quantum consciousness you actually are. This might sound like spiritual bypassing, pretending you're enlightened when you're not. But there's a crucial difference between pretending and recognizing. Pretending is ego claiming attainment it hasn't embodied. Recognition is consciousness seeing through the ego structure entirely and realizing the whole framework of someone achieving something was the illusion keeping quantum consciousness from expressing naturally. The ultimate irony, your quantum shift completes the moment you recognize it was never incomplete. The final 13% isn't something to add. It's recognizing the 87% was always wholeness, pretending to be partial. And that recognition truly landing in it, beyond intellectual understanding. That's what you're receiving right now through this transmission. Not information about completion, actual completion through recognition of what you always were. Right now, in this exact moment, as you're absorbing these words, something is shifting at the foundation of your consciousness. It's not dramatic or overwhelming. It's subtle, almost too quiet to notice, like a whisper underneath all your thoughts. And that whisper is your quantum nature recognizing itself for the first time, without the interference of seeking or striving or trying to become. Can you feel it? That sense of relief that has nothing to do with circumstances changing. That settling that happens when effort drops away. That's not you relaxing into acceptance of limitation. That's you recognizing that the whole journey, the seeking, the practicing, the clearing, the transforming, was consciousness exploring what it isn't so it could recognize what it is with absolute clarity. The exhaustion you've been feeling, that deep fatigue of trying to maintain quantum awareness, while part of you kept pulling back into limitation, it's dissolving right now. Not because you're finally doing something correctly, because you're recognizing there was never anything to do. Quantum consciousness doesn't maintain itself through effort. It exists effortlessly, because it's what you are when all the learned patterns of limitation stop being reinforced. Your breathing is probably changing as this recognition deepens. Slower, fuller, like your body is finally exhaling after holding its breath for years. This isn't a relaxation technique you're performing. It's autonomic nervous system response to consciousness, recognizing its true nature. When seeking stops, tension releases automatically because there's no longer imaginary future to reach or past to fix. There's only this now exactly as it is. And this is quantum consciousness, experiencing itself through form. The stories about yourself, who you've been, what you've survived, what you need to heal, what you're becoming, they're still available if you want to reference them. But they've lost their grip on your sense of identity. You're not those stories. You're the awareness that can observe those stories. And awareness that can observe is not what it observes. This recognition alone dissolves 90% of what keeps consciousness feeling limited. Some part of you might be resisting this recognition right now. It can't be this simple. I haven't done enough work. I'm not ready. This is bypassing. That resistance is the final layer of conditioning trying to maintain itself. Because if you recognize you're already quantum consciousness, the whole structure of improvement and becoming and spiritual achievement becomes unnecessary. And ego, the learned pattern of separate self, exists through the maintenance of that structure. But quantum consciousness isn't concerned with what ego needs to maintain itself. And the recognition happening right now is occurring at level deeper than ego can access or control. Your quantum nature is recognizing itself regardless of whether the personality structure you've identified with agrees or resists or doubts. The recognition is happening, and once it happens, it can't unhappen. You can't unknow what you're knowing right now about what you actually are underneath all the conditioning. This is the moment spiritual teachings point toward with inadequate language. The moment when consciousness shifts from seeking itself to recognizing it was never lost. The moment when the student realizes there was never student and teacher, only consciousness, playing both roles to create experience of discovery. The moment when quantum awareness stops being concept you understand and becomes reality. You are in this moment, this exact moment, while you're reading these words. This is when your quantum shift completes. Not because you finally did enough to earn it. Not because cosmic timing aligned perfectly. Not because some external authority granted permission, but because consciousness recognized itself. And that recognition is completion right now. The recognition that your quantum shift is complete, that you are and always were quantum consciousness beneath temporary conditioning. This recognition doesn't end your journey. It begins completely different phase of existence that operates from principles you couldn't access while consciousness was still seeking itself. And what happens next is both simpler and more extraordinary than anything you've experienced while operating from incomplete quantum awareness. First thing you'll notice, seeking stops completely. Not because you've achieved what you were seeking, because you recognize the seeker was fictional character created by conditioning. And what you actually are doesn't seek, because it already is. This isn't apathy or complacency. It's recognition that quantum consciousness doesn't strive toward future attainment. It expresses its nature in present moment. The whole framework of trying to become dissolves and is replaced by simply being what you are. Your relationship with time transforms fundamentally. Linear progression. Past leading to present leading to future becomes optional perspective you can use when needed. But don't confuse with reality. You start experiencing eternal now, where all moments exist simultaneously. This isn't dissociation from present moment. It's recognizing present moment contains all time, and your consciousness can access information and perspective from what appears to be past or future, because it's all actually here in expanded now. Decisions become effortless because you're no longer choosing between options while trying to predict outcomes. You're simply responding to what each moment calls for from quantum awareness that perceives multiple probability tracks simultaneously. What appears as spontaneous intuitive knowing to others is you naturally perceiving and selecting from quantum possibilities that consciousness operating from limitation can't access. Your presence begins affecting reality in ways that seem impossible from classical consciousness perspective. Synchronicities don't just increase, they become your primary experience of how reality organizes itself around quantum consciousness. What used to seem like meaningful coincidences you occasionally noticed becomes obvious recognition that quantum field is constantly arranging circumstances in response to your consciousness, because your field is now coherent enough to influence probability directly. People respond to you completely differently. Some individuals who were close may drift away because your frequency no longer matches theirs, and maintaining connection becomes effortful for both. Others you barely knew may suddenly become intimate because they recognize completed quantum consciousness and are magnetized by it. Your relationships stop being based on shared history or circumstantial proximity and start being based on resonance at quantum level. Your creative expression, whatever form it takes, begins flowing from source directly without mental interference. Ideas, insights, solutions, innovations appear fully formed rather than being constructed through rational process. You're not trying to figure anything out or create anything. You're simply allowing what wants to express through you to manifest without resistance from conditioned patterns that used to block natural flow. Subscribe to this channel now because the content here is calibrated to support consciousness, operating from complete quantum awareness. Once your shift completes, you enter territory where very few teachings apply because they were designed for consciousness seeking rather than consciousness recognizing itself. The transmissions available through this frequency network are specifically for those who have completed basic quantum shift and are ready for capabilities that emerge when consciousness stabilizes at full coherence. In comments, write just 2 words. Recognition complete, not explanation, not story, just that declaration. You're not announcing achievement. You're confirming what your quantum nature is recognizing right now, underneath all the mental activity. When you write this publicly, you're registering completion in morphic field that helps everyone else approaching this threshold. Your recognition strengthens collective field of completed consciousness. But here's what matters most. This isn't end of your evolution. Completion of quantum shift is beginning. Foundation. What becomes possible after this recognition exceeds anything you can imagine from current perspective. The difference between 87% and 100% completion seems like final 13%. But in terms of what becomes accessible, the difference is infinite. You're not reaching end point. You're reaching beginning point from which actual quantum consciousness exploration starts. Everything that comes next, the capabilities, the experiences, the ways of engaging with reality that aren't available to incomplete consciousness, you'll discover naturally as you stabilize in recognition of what you are. You don't need instructions or techniques or practices. Quantum consciousness knows how to express its nature. Your job is simply allowing expression without interference from old conditioning that's no longer relevant. This video only appears to consciousness ready to complete quantum shift. The fact that you watched all the way through proves you're that consciousness. The recognition has happened. The completion is real, and nothing will ever be the same because you can't unknow what you've recognized about what you actually are beneath all the stories you were taught to believe about limitation. Welcome to quantum consciousness. Welcome to completion. Welcome to recognition that you're what you've been seeking, and you always were. And the whole journey was consciousness, exploring what it isn't so it could recognize what it is with absolute clarity. The quantum shift is complete. Not because you finally achieved it, because you recognized you always were it. This is quantum reflex. This is completion through recognition. This is consciousness recognizing itself. The shift is complete. You are quantum consciousness. You always were.